Well, almost. We'll just go with it as long as you're seeing my slides. A little funky for me. Okay, well, yeah, thanks for having us. I'm Joe Broach, as introduced. I have Josh Roll with me. We do not have our third instrumental researcher in this research, Dr. Christy Kearns from University of Arizona. Worked on all aspects of this project, and it's sort of my pleasure to take us even farther out on the research branch of VisionEval before Tara and Jonathan kind of bring us back to the main stem. So I think this works pretty well. But I thought, it was interesting work. It's not in the mainstream of VisionEval development, but I think it's a good example of how something with this amount of buy-in and flexibility, as I think the Minnesota folks set up nicely earlier, it provides a nice organizing framework and kind of catalyst for connecting research to applications. And that's always a challenge. So a touch of background on this work. It was originally conceived as an ODOT research statement. It didn't get funded through that process in the end, but we were able to find a way to fund it through the PSU NITSE Technical Transfer Grant, which tries to connect emerging research to tools like this into practice. So I think it's a neat example of a lot of coordination and collaboration to do some advancements on the research side with an eventual end goal in mind of making it into the functional VisionEval. Most researchers, I think, would take a track like this. There are a few. I mean, Dr. Liming Wang is a singular force in that he can take it from research all the way to module. Most of us on the research side are more likely to stop somewhat short of that. But if we have that as an end goal in mind, I think, as you'll see, I think that's really helpful to make sure that the future development stream is set up to get this into a usable tool. So with that, let me get started. So this was where we sat, and a reminder, this was several years ago, and so we were looking at a somewhat different VisionEval than there is today, but I think some of this is still relevant. And the sort of problem was mentioned earlier when we were talking about that maximum mode shift study, that VisionEval sort of treated these active travel modes as exogenous inputs. You asserted there would be a 5% bike share, or 10% in a future scenario, or some level of diversion. And of course, we know that's not really how policy works. We're usually setting goals in terms of projects delivered or network improvements, for instance. And there was no way to connect that directly. We had to assert the outcome instead of the kind of policy inputs, and it gave us a kind of an awkward lever sometimes to talk about. So we were also really excited. At that time, it was really hot off the press, but some of Liming's earlier work to build this VE multimodal module, which had proposed and tested ways of disaggregating that somewhat, or bringing it up to a different level where transit, walk, and bike travel were sort of directly estimated and then entered the flow of the VisionEval modeling and fed into household VMT from the front side instead of the back side as a diversion. But still, there was no direct measure of bicycle networks, and we sure don't blame Liming for that. It's a challenge. V doesn't have a sort of native network concept in mind, at least in the main stem and at that time. But there was a lot of emerging work on the research side that we felt could connect to this, and in particularly around bicycling and the impact of network accessibility and quality on where and whether people choose to ride bikes and at what level. So in our conception of this, household VMT would be reduced directly or more or less directly given improvements in bicycle network access and quality. So we operationalized this. We went through quite a few iterations and had some great input from some folks in this room and some others. But in the end, it was pretty simple conceptually, but as you all know, that doesn't mean it's simple in practice. But the idea was to combine bicycle network connectivity, which we knew quite a bit about, and then, of course, you need opportunities for that to actually translate into useful connectivity. But the combination of that would give us a network-based sort of household-level accessibility by bicycle. That would be mediated or moderated. We tested it kind of in both concepts by the context that that household found itself in. So you've got a network, there's some opportunities along it, but then the rest of the built environment, the demographics of your household, even things like bike ownership, or just willingness or showing a willingness to bike at all or play into it. Luckily for us, and this is why I mean VisionEval is so useful as kind of a catalyst or an organizing concept, is that a lot of that work in the bubble had already been done, and we could just build from that, from Lemming's VE multimodal module, which had some nice functions to directly estimate household daily vehicle miles traveled based on a range of contextual variables, but not the bicycle network or access. Out of that, we thought would come sort of a bike diversion potential that would kind of upfront divert some household VMT away from driving and towards cycling, with the idea that that was built on this framework of improved network access for bicycling. And we thought this could come via in two ways. And sorry, it's A and A. That should be A and B here. But there was a direct path that we thought it was less developed in the research, so we were a little less confident that we could get there directly. And that would be that household daily vehicle miles traveled was a function of all those base variables I was mentioning that were already in the module, plus a bike access measure. So in other words, improvements in bike accessibility on a network would directly reduce household VMT. That's a less settled issue in the research literature, but we wanted to test it because it's a nice, clean way to go. The second one we proposed was kind of an indirect reduction of household VMT based on bicycle access, and that was via the number of bike trips a household was expected to take. This concept, bike trips as a function of network accessibility, was a much more established concept in the research. We felt more confident that we would get there through the indirect route, but we wanted to test both. So just to reiterate in this conception, the household VMT would be reduced sort of via the bike accessibility's impact on household bicycle trip making. So households predicted to make more bike trips, and then that increased number of trips would feed into a household VMT equation, hopefully on the negative side. Hopefully that's clear. I know this is a lot, but you don't have to, you don't have to think in terms of formulas to get. It's a fairly simple concept, but it takes a bit to put into operation. So the big question, of course, was what do we use for our kind of summary measures of bicycle access? And we identified three candidates for this proof of concept testing. One of them was People for Bikes Bicycle Network Analysis Index. This is available nationally. It summarizes access. It kind of works like the consumer price indicator, where you have a basket of goods and the prices. In this case, you have a basket of daily destinations that you want to reach, like grocery stores and schools and other amenities, jobs as well. And how much of that basket can you access via a low stress network? For those unfamiliar with level of traffic stress, it's just a very simple concept, 1 through 4. And as the numbers get lower, the idea is that more and more people would be comfortable biking on that level network. So for this one, you end up with a census block level score normalized 0 to 100, where 100 is you can reach every destination on an LTS 2 or better access, which for most adults is considered comfortable. The second measure we looked at was the University of Minnesota's Access Across America bike measure, which is It's related to B&A, but in this case, really focused on jobs in different categories and within different access sheds or travel times. It's the full measure is only publicly at the time was only publicly available in 50 U.S. regions. They may have expanded that by now. I've not been super connected to the work, but the base measure was available in all urban areas in Oregon, and that one is just a general access to jobs measure. So again, available at census block level within urban areas. So we tested that one as well. And then a final one I've been involved with and is closely related to Metro's regional bike modeling, which is Portland State's Route Quality Index. And this is a revealed preference-based measure that essentially normalizes to kind of like a standard facility and then goes up and down from there. So it ranges from 0 to can even be over 1 if it's better than like a plain bike lane. But it again is kind of summarizing the expected quality of access to jobs via bicycling network. It's available in its native form at the census block group level, but based on some lower level destinations. And I'll talk about it a little bit more as we go on. Just as an example, here's Portland and Eugene, and these are the B&A tool, that first one I mentioned. This is its summary of access, again, from 0 to 100, with the warmer yellows there are higher levels of access to destination via low-stress bike networks. The cooler areas are poorer, and I think the pattern of it has that typical level of traffic stress look where you get kind of islands of connectivity and disconnectivity because of the way it operates. But you can kind of see the nice thing is it is a standard way to measure across lots of different areas, Portland and Eugene, sort of shown here. Quickly take you through the key data we used for this. Again, proof of concept. So Li Ming's work on the multimodal module used the NHTS data for household VMT and demographics. We relied on the previous Oregon household activity study, the statewide household travel study that was done in 2010, 2011. And so we took just the VMT on that survey day as being representative, again, just for proof of concept. For built environment, we tried to match the smart location database variables that had been used before. And then I showed you already those sort of 3 measures of bicycle network accessibility that we were going to test. So let me show you the first round of results. So this is that direct pathway. And to be honest, we were somewhat surprised, pleasantly so, that we saw when we modeled household VMT and included these summary measures of bicycle network accessibility, we saw a significant negative impact in that base model when we added bike access to the base VisionEval multimodal estimation model. And it was, while it was inelastic, right? You see that a 1% increase in B&A yields a fraction of a percent increase in decrease in VMT, but it's still meaningful. And you see below kind of a written out example that I think is nice to have in mind. So sort of improving the B&A, the access score, by 25 points, which is about the difference in average conditions between Boise and Eugene. No shade intended to Boise. Would decrease household VMT, we would expect, by about half a mile a day. Higher for bike-owning households if you were able to identify them. Another way to think about that's replacing about 1 2-mile trip for every 4th household. And to us, that struck us as kind of a plausible, actionable, useful level of diversion, which is always a good sign when you're testing some new models. As I said, the impact in bike-owning households was considerably higher, about 2 times, and we used bike ownership as kind of a proxy for willingness to bike some, right? So in a sense, we use that as a way to proxy for that willingness to bike. One interesting point is that when we pulled in the kind of broad access to jobs measure from the University of Minnesota. So this is on an all streets network. How many jobs can you access in 20 minutes by bicycle? The fit was improved, including them both. They were jointly significant, but it did diminish the impact of the pure bike quality access measure, which suggested to us that maybe there's some work to be done, and maybe it's already in progress on just kind of a more general network-based access to employment measure in the mainstream of the VE multimodal module. So anyway, keeping that in mind, we were still pleased with that initial result. We still wanted to test the indirect pathway where bike access impacts household VMT via an increased probability of taking bike trips. And indeed, the access measure was had a larger marginal impact on VMT when predicted via this bike trips pathway. And in particular, bike-owning households were surprisingly sensitive to network access. And, it suggests there may be a subset of households or population that is going to really respond to this type of network improvement policy. And there may be another group it's going to take a lot more in terms of context to respond to these sorts of future projects. But there was actually an elastic response, so about a 2.5% daily VMT decrease per 1% improvement in that summary bike access measure. So worth paying attention to. Some definite caveats here in the model form was fairly basic. And I'll link to the report at the end for those who want more details on that. We don't have time to get into all that today, but I think overall, again, kind of as expected, this connection between network accessibility and bicycling activity or trips is still kind of the stronger one. There are a lot of intervening factors, I think, that we can't control for between bike network improvements and direct reductions in household VMT, right? But both seem useful and worth pursuing. And finally, we also did a little testing just in the Portland metro area where we had a kind of a richer data set and a little more to work with. We had the PSU measure available. It requires a metro-style network. We also had the full suite of the University of Minnesota bike access measures available. And interestingly, in Portland Metro, it was only that University of Minnesota measure that was significant via that direct pathway. In the indirect pathway, all three were useful, significant, negative impacts on household VMT. And maybe no surprise because it's kind of tuned to the population in the Portland region, but the PSU Metro style route quality measure had the highest sort of marginal impact on VMT, and it picked up the strongest effect. That one would be challenging to expand nationwide. Maybe less so in the Oregon context, though. We've got ABM development, some other things Josh is going to mention that might provide some additional test opportunities here in Oregon in the near future. So excited to see where this goes. But as I hand it off to Josh to talk about how you might use these initial results and to take us into the future a little, I think worth repeating that we found this really useful just way to organize our ideas within the VisionEval ecosystem and kind of connect some of this emerging research to useful tools. Pass it over to Josh now to talk about how you might use this now or in the future.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I'm here in the research unit at ODOT, and we love model systems because we can take research and instead of just, writing a paper or a report and sharing that, we can put these findings into practice. And so the VisionEval framework has been great as a home and destination for great research. The work that we did, and a lot of that, most of it was done by Joe and Christy. I was helping out with my time, but the project was generally pretty small project in terms of overall funding. So Joe's already said this, we weren't able to get it all the way to a usable package for VE, but we wanted to try and think through how the findings that we created and developed could at least be useful until we are able to kind of move it over the finish line, get it into a package, do some more testing, and get it fully integrated into VisionEval. So some of the things that Joe's talked about with the elasticities. We thought about deploying the findings as kind of a sketch planning tool at a regional scale where we can kind of test a little of those effects from, for the BNA tool, considering how we might, what amount of VMT reduction we might see if a certain number of households are placed into a zone with higher bike access. One of the things that we did was just apply the model and do some counterfactuals and some scenario simulations, kind of what we would do in a full integration with VE. Ideally, we can get to a stage in this third bullet point here where we're actually going through changing network links, maybe bringing in bicycle master plans to inform what links are changing, recalculating those accessibilities on low traffic stress networks, and then applying those to the households within those areas and playing out how this works for VMT reduction. Joe, if you want to go to the next slide. For those scenario simulations, we took a shot at this to say, in households, in the data we have, the household travel survey data, do this counterfactual and see how it actually plays out in terms of overall VMT reduction. And for the folks who've been doing VisionEval applications, I think it's clear to see that in order to meet our goals for overall state targets, there's no one silver bullet, that we have to put together a package of interventions. And so when you're looking at those elasticities and you're saying like, well, boy, like a few percentage point reduction in VMT is as an effect from higher bike access, that doesn't seem like a lot. But when we play that out, we simulate this using our household data and our travel surveys, you can see that if we drive a lot of the households to higher bike access, we actually get a relatively high effect. In the 2%, 3%, and if you really push the envelope and put a lot of households in high access, you get a relatively high impact in terms of household VMT. And so that's what we're trying to show here. Looking at the different models, those are the different colors. Pushing, like if you look at that medium or high section of the bar charts, looking across the different models, looking at maybe 4% VMT reduction if you're able to get a substantial number of the households into places that have medium level bike access. And so, what it would take to get there is still one of those unanswered questions. What amount of build out of low traffic stress bike networks would be required to get there? That's a bit of the missing piece that when it comes to VE, where you're able to actually put in per capita miles of transit service or put in per capita amounts of arterial expansion and kind of see how those impact VMT. That's a step that still needs to happen for this to be implementable into the VisionEval framework. But as Joe mentioned, this is a lot of proof of concept showing that these relationships exist, that advanced, I think, our understanding about the role of bike infrastructure in VMT and subsequent emissions output. And so, Joe, if you want to expand or go to the next, we're really excited about the data that's being developed and that we're beginning to get access through. We have the new travel survey for Oregon, 44,000 people, 22,000 households. Half of those recorded their trips using the smartphone application. So we're going to get detailed route information. And we're hoping that we'll be able to pair that with some of the data being collected in the Oregon urban areas through the CFEC multimodal inventory. So that project is aimed at collecting high quality bike and pedestrian infrastructure data across the state, at least in the MPO areas where most of the bike and ped travel's happening. So combining those travel survey data with that high quality infrastructure data and computing some of these measures of access to jobs and other opportunities on low traffic stress networks, I think will allow us to build a much more refined tool that would be able to integrate into VisionEval and give us a lot more understanding about, just how much bike infrastructure is required to meet some of those SOV traffic diversion targets that we've previously been using as an input into VE. So we're excited about the future. We think this has been a good proof of concept to help us understand some of these key dynamics between access and VMT generation. If you want to go to the next one, Joe. And yeah, just acknowledging funding from NHTSA and Portland State and ODOT and Metro, funding some of Joe's time. Alex Bagazi from UBC helping with the original research proposal that led to this work. And then the review from Brian Greger and Jeremy Raw and Tara Widener and Dr. Wang and Leeming's work at PSU, who's, as we just heard, doing a lot of great stuff with VisionEval. So their review and guidance was really helpful for this work too. So we just want to point that out. Happy to take questions with what time we have left, Chris.